Welcome to the Creating Great Legislation, How Legislators and Drafters Work Together webinar, brought to you by NCSL. All lines have been placed on a listen-only mode to provide favorable sound quality during today's presentation. To participate during today's webinar, please use the chat box located in the lower right-hand side of your screen. Simply type your message into the box and click on the send button. At this time, it is my pleasure to turn the floor over to your host, Kay Warnock. Ma'am, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I would like to welcome all of you. The Legislative Effectiveness Committee and the Legal Services Staff Section are the sponsors of this webinar, and the Legislative Staff Coordinating Committee provided the funding for the webinar. So we are delighted to be able to provide this free training today. And I think that we're also delighted just at the response that we've had for the webinar. We have over 134 registrants for the webinar, and there are at least 10 states where the participants are going to participate as a group, which is just a wonderful feature. So what I'd like to do is introduce our speaker, Bruce Feustel. He is a senior fellow with NCSL. Bruce has worked in or for state legislatures for over 35 years. He is a former Wisconsin legislative attorney, and he is currently a senior fellow, as I said, in NCSL's Legislative Management Program, where he provides training and educational programs for legislators and legislative staff, and participates in management studies of legislatures. I would also like to mention that Bruce is an amazing resource if you have drafting questions. He has just been amazing to work with. And without any other interruption here, I'd like to give the floor to Bruce.
Well, greetings, everyone. As Kay was talking about my lengthy history, I was thinking back to a day 35 years ago when I was a new drafter in the Wisconsin Legislative Reference Bureau, and I just read the office materials on how to work with legislators and take requests. I was fascinated by how important this was and what a critical step this was, and how legislators must really value the attorneys that they worked with. And I got ready to sit down for my very first drafting request. And in walked Representative Dick Pabst from the Milwaukee area of Wisconsin. And I got my trusty information request pad down, and he immediately signed it. And I was somewhat taken aback, but, sat down and got ready for the information request. And I was half thinking about the fact that his name was Pabst and whether he was connected to the beer family or not, and sort of settled in for what I thought would be a nice lengthy chat about whatever his legislation was. And he gave me one sort of very generalized sentence about what he wanted for the city of Milwaukee, and I bent over and started to write it on my pad. I looked up and he was gone. He was totally vanished, and that was to him providing the drafting request. And it was nothing to work on. It was just a very cursory statement of what was needed, nothing like what you'd use to actually start a drafting request. And I got my first inkling that the drafters, the legislative attorneys and others who worked on drafts, might be taking the legislator drafter relationship and the discussion of a drafting request a little bit more seriously, a little bit more importantly than the legislators themselves. And Dick Pabst obviously was on the end of the spectrum. He just had no patience for giving drafting requests. It wasn't what interested him. He just wanted to start the process and go. But it gave me, my first lesson in terms of looking at this, and that was that legislators might not always have the patience or the inclination to talk about legislative drafting requests. So it's something that I'd have to factor in. Well, that factors into today's subject and the message for the day. Particularly, well-drafted legislation is essential in any state. It's why those of you who are in the drafting end of it, it's the purpose for which you're on board and what you work on. But it's fundamental to the operations and the well-being of any state. And for the legislation to work out well, legislators and drafters have to work together. It's a process where they have to come together in terms of conveying information, ideas, and decisions. But there are common problems and tension areas. That one with the original legislator that I mentioned is just one of the kinds of things, a lack of interest or patience for the details. But there are a whole series of common problem and tension areas that we'll talk about today. And then lastly, the theme and one of the messages for today, legislators and drafters in the various states have looked at these issues, and I think they have some tips that will be helpful to you as you do your work in your own state. So that's where we're going today, some of the themes that we'll attend to. Michael at the beginning mentioned a bit about typing your responses in the chat box on the right-hand side. Just a reminder at the start of this that this is designed for you to participate. I'll have several points at which I'm asking you to participate, so be ready for those. And then you just type your answer in on the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. You won't be able to see all the responses, but I will, and the group here that's working on this webinar will. Just a note in terms of confidentiality and expectations. Your names appear to me on the responses that you make, and I may use your name to promote a sense of participation much as it would in a live seminar, but I won't use your name if you're saying something that's potentially embarrassing that I think you might not want repeated. If you're particularly wary of me using your name, just put that in the chat box saying, don't use my name, here's my response, something along those lines. But generally speaking, I want to use the names of various people who talk just to give that sense of what the source is of different ideas. It helps promote the whole idea of a wider network and the sharing of thoughts and advice. So that's the basic operating procedure, that you type in your answers. I will use your name unless I think it's potentially embarrassing what you have to say, or that you specifically ask me not to use it. Well, one of the things I mentioned at the beginning was that well-drafted legislation is absolutely essential in each state. And it seems self-evident, but it is one of the underpinnings for why we're even talking about this subject. We think that legislation is important. It rests on the fact that most citizens in a state are law-abiding. And so when the laws are clear to people, then those who are naturally law-abiding have a better ability to follow the law. It's just a basic aspect, but it does rest on the fact that people are basically law-abiding, and if you draft clear, concise legislation, it adds to the likelihood that people will act in the manner that the legislature intended. Having clear laws also improves general respect for the law, confidence in government, but it also does things like promote investment and business prospects, that the clarity, predictability, and accountability in laws helps businesses decide where to invest, where to bring their operations, that sort of thing. Having the clear laws also allows the government agencies themselves to be more efficient and effective in creating their rules and procedures for carrying out those laws. And all of the laws, having them clear, consistent, and out there on the web or in other spots where they can access them, promotes transparency throughout government. So a basic provision on the importance of legislation, but something we always need to keep in mind in terms of why what we do is important, the idea of creating great legislation. Well, a bit on the bill drafting process. And there are some legislators on the line who are perhaps less familiar with the full steps involved. Most of you who draft are quite familiar with all these steps. But essentially in the process, an overview would be that the legislator or some other group approaching a legislator provides an idea for legislation, comes to the drafter, and the drafter asks a series of questions to clarify the idea sufficiently to start the drafting process. Some drafting requests are so simple that questions aren't necessary, but with any kind of moderate or complex draft, there are going to be questions that need to be asked to help clarify, shape the idea, give it some muscle and flesh on the bones of the original drafting request. Then the drafter has to spend some thinking time, thinking through the aspects of the request, make some initial plans for research and writing, and then conduct the research regarding the legality and workability of the idea, then actually writing the legislation. The legislator would review the legislation. And the final point, and one that any practitioner knows, these steps don't always go in order. They often loop back. Starting research may take you back to more questions, and even writing and rewriting legislation brings other things to mind. So these steps are generally adhered to, but they don't always follow in a nice linear path. Some background thoughts on this drafting process. And in today's process, when we were talking about the drafting issues, what we're focusing on today is those points at which the drafter and the legislator intersect, where they work together, where they convey information, where they think things through, but those points at which the two work together. And in terms of the background kinds of issues that need to be addressed, it's the thought that it's the drafter's responsibility to help the legislator hone the request. The legislator may often just have the germ of an idea, a general sense of where he or she wants to come out on a particular policy or an issue or a problem, and it's that drafter's ability to ask questions that goes through some of the what-ifs to make it more precise. And in fact, what the drafter does is focus on the typical journalist questions, the who, what, why, where, when, and how questions to give better shape to a drafting request. Who, what, which people do you want to cover in this request, which professions or which groups, age groups, that sort of thing. Do you want to cover what behavior, what actions are you covering? The why is important for helping the drafter understand the purpose of the request. It may not be explicitly stated in the bill, but it helps the drafter understand. But anyways, if the drafter has those who, what, why, where, when, and how questions in mind, it helps the drafter think of questions that will clarify a drafting request. And in terms of the legislator essentially needs to convey enough information so the drafter can create the bill that the legislator wants. So the drafters aren't magical. They can't mind read. They need enough information, enough clarity, enough direction to get the bill that the legislature needs. Well, what's the problem? Why are we here? What goes wrong in these interactions between drafters and legislators that we even need to think about it? Well, part of the problem is that there are some conflicts in the various roles that the drafter and the legislator play. The drafter has a role of being objective, not pushing any particular point of view or end result, but trying to help the legislator think through the various pros and cons of a particular approach. But the drafter constantly has to think from that objective perspective in all his or her actions with the legislator, but needs to be forward enough to question the legislator, to give greater clarity, and often question the legislator in a situation where the legislator may not know the answer or may not have the patience to explore the issue that they're dealing with. The drafter has responsibilities to address the legal and practical issues in a draft, but also has the purpose of basic customer service as any legislative staffer would have. And that connects to the next point about protecting against the rule of no surprises, as well as trying to help the legislator as much as possible. The drafter is trying to think through the draft from a standpoint of making sure that legislator doesn't do anything stupid, doesn't do anything that would make the legislator look bad. And sometimes in thinking through these things, asking questions, and probing to make sure that there are no surprises, it feels to the legislator like the drafter is sort of taking over the process or asking too many questions or just raising all the negative issues involved, being the Dr. No, telling them all the problems with the draft. And that sometimes rubs legislators wrong. The legislator needs to make the policy decisions as to the outcomes in a draft. Those are up to the legislator, and that's the legislator's responsibility. The role of the legislator is to address practical and political issues relating to the draft. One of the things you'll note is that really the practical issues, the will this work, is really a shared responsibility for both the legislator and the drafter to be looking at. Also, the legislator needs to decide who's going to be in the circle of confidentiality. The various states out there have different rules on confidentiality, but most of you operate under a major value that the drafts are confidential, and the legislator controls between the drafter and the legislator, and the legislator decides if there are other people who can be brought into the conversation. Now, the problem is that if you just have the two of you, there's a lot of knowledge of the problem, a lot of experts or people who are directly affected who may have key information who aren't in that circle of confidentiality. So on occasion, legislators will say, we'll talk to Joe Dokes, who is actually a farmer who is dealing with these crop issues, or is a school teacher who has run into this education problem, or that sort of thing. But it's the legislator who decides whether the confidential relationship between the drafter and the legislator will be expanded. And there are pros and cons in that, but the decision rests with the legislator, not the drafter. And lastly, the legislator has to review the draft and make sure that he or she is comfortable with it and comfortable moving forward. So in just those two initial points, the various roles, you have aspects that are potentially in tension, the political issues. There may be reasons to do something from a political standpoint, but that runs into legal or constitutional problems. Both are addressing the practical aspects of a draft, and actually neither may know the answers as to whether it's practical or not in the real world. That circle of confidentiality is the kind of thing where the draft may benefit from having an expanded group of providing input, but things may leak out if more people are brought into the conversation. So just in some of the basic role aspects, there are potential problem areas. Further potential problem areas, and this goes to the DICPAP's drafting request at the beginning. To most legislators, the bill draft is merely a tool to use. The bill serves a political purpose to bring forward that and bring about change, but they are often not interested in the details and are glad to leave the details to others, and sometimes the drafter needs the legislator to be interested enough to be able to answer the questions to move forward. Time factors are often a huge issue for the drafter, trying to sort out when the draft is wanted, almost always, as soon as you can get it, but when is it really needed? You may have some rules on the drafting priorities in the state, but it's often something that has to be massaged and balanced and a certain reasonableness standard. But usually the time factor is something that limits the drafter's ability to spend as much time as he or she might want to. And I've mentioned some of those considerations, but for any draft, you've got legal issues relating to harmonizing with the statutory provisions that are already in existence. You have the constitutional provisions, possible federal law provisions, the legal aspects that the drafter has to take into account, the practical, will it work in the real world issues, and the political ramifications. What will this mean politically for the legislator by moving forward with this particular bill, both in terms of party politics, but also local ramifications. How will this play in my district? So first, let's look at some basic absolutes. What are some of the things that absolutely have to be adhered to in a drafter's work and a legislator's work in the drafting process? Well, confidentiality, however it's defined in your state and however it's directed by a particular legislator for that draft, whatever is in place, the drafter has to adhere to. I've talked to many legislators, and if there's anything that inspires confidence in them, in drafters, and also loses it when it's not there, is confidentiality. So it's a rock foundational concept that, however it's defined in your state, must be adhered to by the drafter. The fiduciary responsibility, the idea that you are acting in trust for the legislator, you have the legislator's best interest in mind, you're trying to capture what that legislator wants and doing your best to carry that out. It sort of combines with the best faith effort that you work on that person's behalf and you do it as to the best effort that you can, not from any particular viewpoint of your own or your offices or that sort of thing. The legislator is also responsible for creating a legally sound draft, and that may be as legally sound as you can get it if the legislator wants to pursue something that raises a constitutional issue, but your responsibility is to put it on the best legal footing that you can. You act with respect for the legislator, for staffers, for lobbyists, for whoever are conveying the request to you, and you work diligently to carry it out. From the legislator's side, there's a requirement for clarity, that you don't send the drafter off on a wild goose chase on the wrong idea or an idea that you don't really intend to follow up on, but you're clear about it, again, as best you understand it, you clearly state what it is that you want in terms of the draft. You're honest with the drafter. Now, it's a question of how much you disclose and whether you talk about all the reasons why you might be doing something. I'm not saying that there's a requirement for full disclosure, but you don't mislead the drafter by saying that you're trying to accomplish one thing when you're secretly trying to do something else, or you don't try to require the drafter to use language without explaining what it is that you're trying to accomplish with it. The legislator also has a respect requirement in terms of treating staff respectfully. Not that legislators always remember to say thank you or that sort of thing, but they act with basic respect and dignity in working with the drafter. And the legislator is responsible for review. That role might fall to a staff member on the legislator's staff that might be given to one particular aide or another in the state that has a fair amount of staff, but ultimately the legislator bears the responsibility for reading through the draft. If there's something that the legislator doesn't understand or doesn't feel comfortable going forward, then it's the legislator's responsibility to ask the drafter why it's in there, what it does, that sort of thing. Once the draft is introduced, the legislator is going to be the one questioned about it, having to move it forward in committee and on the floor, and will be taking responsibility in a number of ways. So that responsibility rests with the legislator in one form or another. So some of the challenges for drafters in working with legislators may not have the patience or inclination to discuss the draft. Instructions may come by email, and the legislator won't be there in person to ask the questions of. You may have to take the questions and write your questions down and follow up by email or set up a meeting, that sort of thing. Legislators may not understand the importance of the bill draft and need to have that explained. And legislators may make unrealistic time demands and may not know exactly what it is that they want. The drafter may have to do some education on the importance of the draft or the steps that will have to be taken. In some way, the drafter will have to convince the legislator that the drafter can be trusted, and that can go both to the skills aspect, but also that the drafter can be trusted in terms of confidentiality. But ultimately, it comes down to that last bullet point, and that's that the drafter has to convince the legislator that the best bill comes from thinking and working together on the project. The challenges for legislators, you have to think about how much information to really share with the drafter, delegate the responsibility sometimes to staff, lobbyists, or someone else to convey the drafting instructions to the drafter, decide if that confidentiality group should be expanded, and at the end decide who besides the legislator needs to review and approve the bill before introduction. There may be political, practical, other reasons to have a wider review group. So, first point of audience participation. Talked a bit about the process and the kind of qualities that I see as important. But what do you think? What are the qualities and standards the drafter must adhere to? What's important from the drafter's perspective in that drafting process to make sure that the right outcome is achieved? What are your thoughts? So please type in your answer. I'll respond to some of them as they come in. But what's important? And just type it in on the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen and press send. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of responses in terms of communication. The communication skills are absolutely critical. Larry Hanapaki from Wisconsin. Well, Larry, your response just zipped out of my line of sight, but mentioned confidentiality and a number of other aspects. There are a lot of mentions of impartiality, nonpartisanship, neutrality, sticking to those. I think one of the things that I failed to mention I was going to mention later, but you seeing in a number of the responses, is how valuable it is to know the subject matter. For those of you states that have subject matter specialists, having the underlying knowledge in those areas. For instance, if you know the criminal law, if someone comes in with a criminal law request, you can respond intelligently with alternatives, can mention some things that have been considered perhaps in past years, but you give a better context. There's Walker Reagan mentions courage, and I think that's a critical piece, and it's sort of the cutting edge aspect of this seminar, that sometimes you have to have the courage to make legislators aware of the things that they might not have thought about, or more importantly, they might not want to hear. It's the old speaking truth to power. Mary Quaid raises the very important point of knowing your limits, that you have to stay within the limits of your particular role and not move beyond that. The ability to listen from Pam Finley. Tact, the idea of raising those key points that you need to raise, but raise them in a way that don't raise the hackles or the concern of the legislator. One of the things that was mentioned to me by Julie Pellegrin earlier was the idea that you need to get enough information so that you can fill in the gaps later. Some of you have mentioned the philosophy of the legislator. And in some ways, you're getting enough information so that you can go forward on the bill draft. And when you come into those question areas, you have enough information to make an intelligent guess about how the legislator's philosophy and political motivations would respond and fill those gaps. So it puts you in a good enough situation to act in that fiduciary manner. A couple other aspects that I'm seeing is practical problem solving. An excellent piece that even though you are not the farmer, you're not the teacher, you're not the doctor who's being asked about or is the potential subject of a particular piece of legislation, you know enough about them and the practical reality of what they have to do that you can help think through from a practical standpoint with legislators. Also seeing references to patience, and it really does take patience to move forward. Hang on a second. Yeah. So on to the next piece here, which is legislator qualities. Okay, hang on for a second. We're having a question raised here. Okay, a question from Jill Gray about communicating with the legislator's office, finding the situation exactly the reverse of my slide. It's usually the drafter who runs off and completes the draft without asking questions of the legislator. Well, I may have been showing my experience as a drafter, so that's a great question. That I really mean to convey that the patience has to come on both sides, and the drafter, as someone else mentioned in terms of patience, both sides have to have the patience to go through the necessary questions and ask them. So if it's a drafter and you're with either a legislator or an aide or a lobbyist who's acting on behalf of a legislator, time is well spent at this question standpoint and thinking through as much as possible at this point, giving people the chance to think through from a variety of standpoints is critical and is the best practice in terms of working with a legislator. So Jill, thanks for mentioning that. And the duty really goes to both sides to have the patience to work through these kinds of questions. So let's go on to the legislator qualities. What are the qualities and standards that a legislator must adhere to in working with drafters in the drafting process. What's important from the legislator's standpoint in making sure that the process works well. Okay, seeing a number of provisions on that willingness to invest time to adequately explore the issues, takes ownership of the project, communicates well, good grooming. That's a interesting thought, but receptiveness to the drafter's explanations from Rawl. I think that's a really good point, and I hadn't really thought of it in terms of the receptiveness, but very much it's a mindset of a willingness to explore, an openness to think through, and that comes when there's no feeling that the drafter is trying to take over, but is assisting the legislator. Prompt response to a drafter's questions. I think that's an important aspect in that there is. I'm just going through a couple questions here. That the drafter can get hung up with questions, that some questions need to be answered quickly to move on to other aspects of a draft. So treating the questions seriously, getting back quickly won't stall the draft. And often it's best to get those questions answered while the drafter is still thinking and in the mode of working on it. Reviewing and understanding a bill draft before introduction. Excellent point. Viewing the drafters as trustworthy. Delegating effectively, communicating clearly with the district staff. I noticed that we're having one person having a problem with the chat tab. We're going to try and follow up with that person to make sure. So Susan, hopefully we'll be back to you quickly, or we will enable you to do that. We've got staff working on that as we speak. Timeliness being mentioned again, large issues, involvement of interested parties. I think that's an important one from Zarin James, that when there are people who are interested in this, who have a stake, that they get involved in the process. It's hard to create a draft, float it out there, and then have it shot down because the people who actually work in the area and are affected by the problem realize that there are major problems with it. Mary Quaid raises another good point about the respect also has to go to the fact that understand that the drafters work for all the members. So in terms of the timeliness, that there may be other requests that the person's working on. Also, that the confidentiality that a drafter shows for one legislator's draft means that you also can't explain what you're doing for other legislators, that all legislators deserve that confidentiality and get that confidentiality. Many of the same kinds of basic values in play here in terms of respect and honesty, but also some responsibility for your end of the process and timely review and timely handling the drafter's questions so that problems can be addressed. Okay, well, let's move on to the next slide. And what I'm going to do now is go through a series of tips. And part of what I think is helpful in this is to take the suggestions and ideas. Okay, a step backwards is our group has found E.M. Miller's suggestion, and let me just step back to that and share that before moving on. EM mentions discussing and sharing legislative requests and drafts with other drafters in your office is important, and that's excellent idea. Part of the confidentiality for all the states that I'm familiar with means that you can share the request with people in your own office, that they talking through with people who draft in your same subject, but also people who have more experience, gives you a better product. It also helps you sometimes get ask the right question. Sometimes the other person knows that, whoa, you just lost me there. Hang on. Sorry. Just a second on that. I just want to go to EM's last point, and that goes back to the courage point. The idea that you shouldn't be afraid to tell a member that the idea needs more thought and research. That sometimes in starting on a project, you realize it's a bigger, more complicated draft than you thought. It's going to take more work. It's something that, to make it the best draft for that drafter and make sure that the drafter doesn't get surprised on the floor with problems, you have to raise it. So 2 good points from EM. One, that you should always think about consulting other drafters in your office, keeping that confidentiality, but thinking through with someone who can give you some good advice, either from the subject area perspective or from the longer drafting perspective, and also making sure that you share with the legislator when something needs more thought and research. Thanks, Stacy. Then we'll move back. And we're going to start a series of tips now. And these come from some questions I posed on the Legal Services listserv a few years ago, and some follow-up research I did in the last month. But a number of you have provided good ideas, as you are today. But I want to share with you some themes of advice that came from a number of you. First comes from Gordon Malaysia in Wisconsin, and that's a reminder, particularly at the start, to focus on problem and solution. If you're the drafter, help the legislator focus on, tell me the problem, what are you trying to solve, what are examples of it, or background information, that sort of thing, and tell me how you want to solve the problem. Focus the legislator on the problem and solution aspects, and lead the legislator away from trying to exactly draft the language that will ultimately go in. If you can focus on what are we trying to solve, how do we want to solve it, things go much better. Second tip comes from a variety of sources, from John Bjornson, who I see is on the line today, Julie Pellegrin, 2 drafters, but also from Representative Doug Jones in Idaho, or former Representative Doug Jones. And that is, and it's the underlying theme to the whole workshop, and that is that respecting and building the relationship between the drafter and the legislator is the most important thing to do. That when you build that relationship between the two, when you build on successes of creating good drafts together, it builds the trust, and it's a two-way trust. The legislator trusts the drafter to fill in the gaps, to help brainstorm and think through and arrive at legally sound, good legislation. And the drafter trusts the legislator to give the information that's needed to proceed. The drafter can think out loud and realize, the legislator realizes that it's not a matter of the drafter trying to push a particular policy choice. It's just the drafter trying to help the legislator think things through. Trust is built up working together and learning about one another. Sometimes it's just learning about background information, just the basic human connection that two people work together better when they know each other better. Part of it is finding the right level of pushing and prodding. The drafter needs to raise questions and be a devil's advocate, but not being the devil, not being the person who constantly is seen as the naysayer. Gets to know the legislator and the motivation behind what the legislator does. That all allows the drafter to fill in the blanks as they're going forward. I'm getting a message from Tom Valley about difficult to build trust in a term-limited environment. Boy, Tom, you're absolutely right. I think the key is, though, that even one successful provision is, one successful working situation can be helpful. I think it also stresses, I see it, Kay, the need to improve your training portion, and you can increase the training that you do, the kind of training that Wendy Madsen pushed forward in Wyoming and others. You can start building that trust in the new member orientation. But Tom, your point is valid. I think it just goes to the point that it's going to be even harder in the term-limited environment. I'm also getting a question from Edna and Dunn about leaving out a step, that the legislator is considering the drafter's suggestions about the proposed solution. The drafter may have a better, easier solution. Very good idea that when you have the best kind of relationship, the drafter can float ideas out there about ways to go, or can do a memo after the first round of results or first research and thoughts have gone through. So I think legislators being open to considering suggestions, especially when the legislator trusts the drafter, is very important. So the drafter may well come up with a better, easier solution. I think it goes back to the point that all the steps in the drafting process are somewhat fluid, and that you do better when you're willing to go back to a previous step if it'll all move to going to creating a better final work product. I think it goes to the underlying aspect of openness, that both the drafter and the legislator have to be open to thinking about things, to revisiting issues, to taking the extra step to create drafting quality. So Edna, thank you very much. Next tip is observing the fundamentals. And Doug Hines from Tennessee points out that, and this strikes me as an important reminder to the term limits point that was raised earlier, that there's a lot of value to constantly thinking of the fundamentals and those absolute points. The drafter constantly thinking as you're in the conference, I'm going to be objective about this. I'm going to think through all the pros and cons, even possibly expressing that to the legislator, but sort of adhering to those fundamental aspects and returning to those in your thinking and your approach with legislators. Doug likes to refer to legislators by title, even though you may have worked with them a number of times. It's a small thing to help both of you remember whose role is, which of you has which role, who's the ultimate decider, the ultimate boss in this. But by referring by title, it helps Doug connect back to the fact of what's his role in this, how is he helping, and it also helps him, particularly when he's working with non-lawyer members, remembering his role in pointing out the legal aspects of things. And it also helps him remember the clear lines not to cross as he's working on a particular meeting. Michael Chernick from Vermont helps us with the thought of persistence and professionalism, that the drafter takes a professional attitude in providing the clear, objective advice, that different people can vary on the formality, informality level. Doug Himes mentioned about liking to always refer by title. I would suggest that each of you has to find your own level that works for you. I know in my own state that Peter Grant would be more informal, Jeff Kiesel would be more formal, but both of them were wonderful at eliciting information, but they did it in their own style. And I think the key is to use your own style, but do it in a respectful way. It can be formal or informal, but it has to be within the dictates of your own agency and the rules and customs within your own legislature. But the key is that you're following through on the correct drafting steps. But what Michael stresses is that need to be persistent, be persistent enough to ask the questions that clarify the request and improve the draft. Nancy Sear from Nebraska, our current overall staff chair, suggests that drafters need to help legislators think from beginning to end. You ask the questions that consider both the creation of the law, the implementation steps, and the ultimate enforcement of the law. You have to think of how this law is going to look at the beginning of its process, the middle or ongoing process, and the ultimate consequences aspect. And she raises a point, and this is a connection to Toby Dorsey, who's written legislative drafters handbook, a very helpful piece of publication on the drafting process. But Toby's, one of his major points is the drafter has to think more about the thinking process than the writing process. And I think it's underlying what Nancy is doing, help us underlying that the role of the drafter is the thinking process and helping the legislator think through what needs to be done. And all the time spent clarifying a drafting request really saves time later on, avoids mistakes and surprises. We're having another question raised. Under the time constraints of a legislative session, thinking process and writing process often have to be simultaneous. Absolutely right, Eric. Things have to be done at warp speed, and some of the things I'm suggesting are things that you do in the ideal, things that you may have longer to do in the run-up to a session. It's limited, but I think having drafters with the mindset of taking the extra step, taking a step back, and I think that's part of what Nancy is saying, even if you have to shut your door for a while and delay things, but give things an extra thinking through, it can save a major mistake down the line. So you're right, the thinking and writing is often simultaneous, but it's on the drafter to take that extra reflection time to make sure it works. And this next point feeds into that as well, the working through examples that I got from both Peggy Kearns, a former legislator from Emily Berquist in Vermont. The idea that a legislator often does start with a vague idea in mind, and that it's walking through a real-life example together, how this bill would work, how a person would be affected by it, what they'd have to do if it's it's streamlining an approach for application for a deer hunting license. It's actually walking through all the steps of applying for the license, who would be the agent, what authority they'd have, all that sort of thing. Getting another indication for Pam Finley's, sometimes a legislator needs to see something in writing to consider the issues raised by a drafter. Another excellent point, Pam. I think part of this is knowing each legislator and what works for that particular person. some legislators work much better when they have something written to bounce off of. I used the preliminary draft concept a lot when I was in Wisconsin. I'd do the initial draft and say, you know, are we on the right line? Here are the questions that came to me as I did this, but something so that I didn't invest a ton of time in the full draft, but also fit to a legislator who was better equipped to respond to a bill rather than just thinking through with nothing in front of him or her. So I think it's an important point that many legislators, or maybe all people from time to time, but many people often do better by having something to work off of. I think it goes back to the idea that often the best drafts are a bounce back and forth, you know, initial discussion, drafter goes off, writes up something, maybe a preliminary draft that doesn't answer everything but drafts the guts of the bill, gets it back to the legislator gets a chance to think about this, figure out what's on the right track. It all goes back to the point, though, that sometimes you don't have the time to do that, but when you do have the time, using a preliminary draft helps a lot. But in any event, at some point in the process, working through examples avoids surprises at the hearing or on the floor for the legislator. Another point is creating an interview checklist. You can't anticipate everything, but Steve Harrelson, representative from Arkansas, and Pam Shannon from Wisconsin, one of the committee staff in Wisconsin, legislative committee staff, talked about having an interview checklist. And you have some checklist issues that all drafters have, some like E.M. Miller was talking about, the subject area experts, but each person creates a checklist, whether it's in your own mind or you've got a physical checklist. But you think of the questions that you need for each drafting request. You also have additional questions for ones that are in, you know, campaign finance or other areas that might be. But some typical ones are who's going to enforce this new law? Will this agency need personnel, money, resources, something else to be able to step up to the plate to actually do that enforcement? What are the consequences? What happens to people who disobey this law that we're creating? So creating an interview checklist just helps you be more efficient and effective. Tip from Letitia Vandepute in Texas for legislators. Her suggestion to legislators was sharing your strategy to the drafter. 3 main reasons to carry a bill: change policy, raise awareness, or create a decoy in her mind. And she said that the legislator and ultimately the drafter both do a better job if the drafter is clear on what the purpose is. Now, there's a caveat to this, and that is that the drafter has to create a law that's going to work. One of the examples we had in Wisconsin was of the Potato Industry Board, a request that seemed specious when it came in because there isn't a whole lot of potato industry in Wisconsin, but it was asked for and then ultimately came in and was passed because of a budget agreement, and all of a sudden the bill that looked like no logical reason to go forward and something that was just done to raise awareness actually became law and had to work. But it helps the drafter do a better job when he or she understands what the legislator is ultimately trying to do with this. Okay, we're getting another request to connect. Greg Riley saying a good preliminary draft can not only provide the member with clarity for what they want to do, but also useful in working with the stakeholders on a particular issues. It allows interested parties an opportunity to revise. So Greg uses version 1, version 2, and so on to refine the large pieces of legislation that often require compromise. So very good point that not only is the preliminary draft good in terms of allowing the legislator to make mid-course corrections, but it also allows them to tie in with the stakeholders and make sure that they're on track with the people who ultimately need and need to connect back to the bill. Avoiding deadline rushes here from Pam Shannon. Many states have deadline for bill requests, and the complex bills really do need the digging and thinking time. In the rush of session, you just can't get that. So if legislators can think through on the more complex pieces, get those in before session or in a lull in the drafting time floor period, that can certainly improve quality along the way. Getting a decoy bill. A decoy bill is essentially, question about what a decoy bill, it's essentially something that's designed to pull attention to it. It was what sometimes got referred to as the hairy arm, something that everybody aims at and responds to and worries about, and then the legislator looks magnanimous by coming in with a second bill that's much more moderate and which the legislator intended to use all along. So I think the idea is that sometimes you float a bill out there that somewhat scares people or somewhat pushes the envelope, then come back with a bill that looks much tamer and is really what the legislator wanted all along. And in that way, it helps the drafter to know that they, what the purpose is, and the drafter is probably also drafting the compromise bill anyway. But it's just that there are different political motivations for different bills. Pam Ray mentions the model bill limitation. Drafters tend to cringe when they hear, just draft me up this model legislation. Legislators tend to think that all the work has been done on the model legislation, whereas usually model major changes may need to be integrated into the model bill to make it harmonize, make it in harmony with your state's laws. This somewhat goes back to Gordon Malaysi's original point that you need to think problem and solution. Legislators often will see model legislation, think, oh, this is a good idea, but it's important to take the step back to what are we really trying to solve here and what outcomes do you want, and the model legislation, which may be helpful, but it may also ignore and get you off on the wrong track and not into the problem-solving mode. Dave Thomas in Arizona urges legislators to connect the drafter with a real party and interest. This goes back to that question of confidentiality. It helps the drafter to talk to the person who really wants the bill. Often the legislator is a conduit for a constituent or a lobbyist or somebody who wants legislation, and they approach the legislator who is the only one who's allowed to ask for the legislation. But it really helps the drafter to connect to the real party and interest. You get a clearer picture to talk to the person who really has the problem. I mentioned the mid-course corrections. Corrections, you all have mentioned that as well in the kinds of problems. The idea of doing a preliminary draft to check in with the legislator, that sort of thing. And it's important to meet to go over the issues, provide memo, explaining the questions that have arisen. I'm being urged to zip through a few more of the tips so we get to our problem slides, so I'll move fairly quick to these next ones. Although this point is a controversial one, protecting the bill file. And it's an anonymous source on this one, which goes also to the idea that the bill file is open to the public in most states after introduction. In Montana, it's open immediately, and in a few states, the bill file is closed, but most states it opens to the public after introduction. So that anything that's in there is potentially embarrassing to the legislator or can be used for political purposes. So I've mentioned at various times, hang on, Kay, that the drafter needs to consult on the information that needs to be preserved on the file because you have dual purposes in mind. You have to worry about whether or not there's enough information there that makes the draft understandable to people who try to legitimately understand what the motivation and the reasons are behind a draft, but you're also trying to make sure that the legislator doesn't give away strategy around how they're trying to win the particular policy. And you've also asked the legislator to be open so that you understand better how to fill in the gaps. You don't want to have to use that against the legislator by putting potentially hurtful information in the drafting file. So the drafter has to think about what goes in the file, make sure that you're sharing the kind of information that's helpful for legal and practical background, but you omit strategy. I'm seeing a comment from E.M. Miller saying the greatest challenge involves the inherent conflict brought about by the dual role of drafter committee staffer when a bill having potential constitutional issues rears its head, requires a member insists on going forward without modification. Confidentiality rule can be strained. There is a definite, for those of you who both staff committees and draft, you are put in a conflict. It's a practical conflict. It's a constant tightrope. I think a number of other states out there face that same issue, and it's a good point. I think when you're initially drafting, you have to sort of be in the moment and do the absolute most you can to give advice to the legislator. But when you're in committee, you have a different client, and I think it is inherently strained. And I think the best thing in those circumstances is to be absolutely clear in your drafting manual as to how you handle those situations, and talk with leadership and other legislators about this conflict. I think talking through those things before session, noting where you've run into problems, is probably the best approach. I'm going to quickly move through the last couple of slides. I want to give you all a shot at the case studies that I have at the end. Reminder from Peggy Kearns to legislators of the great value of carefully circulating the draft beyond just your own office, that ultimately the legislator will get questions about the political, practical, and legal aspects of things, and moving beyond just the drafter and the legislator, if you haven't done so already, is really helpful. So circulating to people you trust really improves things from the legislator's standpoint. Jeff Wentworth, Senator from Texas, encourages legislators not to shy away from their role as the boss, that they should read and insist. The legislators should be open to good ideas, but constantly make sure that they're the ones who are deciding, making the policy choices. Jeff says it may require multiple redrafts, but that's okay to make sure that you ultimately get back to your decisions on things. Doug Himes raises the point that the only way that you ultimately improve is to survey, that you survey legislators at the end of a session seeking honest feedback about how they viewed the drafting relationship. Were they happy with the quality of the draft, the quality of advice, all that sort of thing. Following up with troubling responses, deal with small problems before they become big. I have a question about whether if the bill file is open, how can you maintain confidentiality? Well, you're confident, you maintain your confidences about the conversations that you had. The only, what's open is what is contained in the bill file. I don't know exactly how it works in Montana. I'm curious to how it works out is in a practical manner, but essentially the open file, if someone comes to you with a question on something in there, you can describe what's in the file and give you responses to that, but mention talking to the legislator is the way to go. I'm going to stop responding to those questions so you won't do more mentions of those until we get to the actual case studies, because we only have about 15 minutes left. Conclusion, build and nurture the legislator drafter two-way trust. That's the important step to follow. Follow the tips that were provided here and develop your own. It's really developing your own, both individually and as an agency, that are important. Also, when you sense that the tension is developing, and as one of you mentioned, it can be either from the legislator saying that the drafter is leaving too early, or the drafter thinking the legislator is leaving too early, or you're thinking that things aren't going as you would hope. Explain why you're asking questions or providing advice. Go back to Doug Heim's point about the fundamentals. Explain your role and what you're trying to do, but try to diffuse that tension. Use that good communication that people have mentioned. And observe those absolutes: confidentiality, fiduciary responsibility, honesty, and respect. Those are all important. I've attempted to deal with questions as they've come up and as the staff here have pointed them out. So I think we'll spend almost all the rest of our time on the case studies and your responses and the questions that come up in those. So the first question is this first one, which is, what was that all about? You're a drafter and a legislator comes into your office to request a bill draft. You've never worked with a legislator who begins to ask for a revision of the school aid funding formula. You ask a few clarifying questions and the legislator stands up and says, "I can tell you don't approve of my legislation," and walks out without another word. You thought you were being normal, asking normal clarifying questions. You're not sure what triggered the response. What do you do? So let me hear your responses and type into the chat box, and let's see what you have to say. I'm getting a interesting response of hide or tell the boss, but I'm actually getting a couple of key points, somewhat humorous, so I won't necessarily mention those, but they are important. That you do have to tell your supervisor. The supervisor is the one who's trying to make sure that the office is responding, and that's an important point. But Susan Mielke's point of calling the office and ask to meet with them, I think you try to damage control immediately. I think, sort of a passage of time causes problems. I'd almost get up out of my desk and follow the person out and say, wait a minute, I'm trying to make sure that I'm acting in your best interest here. There's different levels of how you can do that professionally, but I'm getting a lot of points saying that you contact the legislators trying to make an explanation. You try to communicate. You try, as Cheryl Reinhardt is mentioning, you forget your own feelings about this. You try to be professional. Susan Fox mentioning that your importance here is following up, tracking them down, and explaining them. You apologize for any misunderstandings, even if you don't think it's your fault, but you bend over backwards to try to make sure that this is successful. I think two things are going on here. One, you do inform your supervisor to make sure that the supervisor understands what's happened and make sure that they don't hear about it from some other source, but they know what's happened within the office. But the other is that you do your darndest to make sure that you deal with the problem. You try to put your own feelings behind you, and you move forward and make sure that you make the extra effort to say, I'm just trying to make sure that I come up with the best draft for you. The questions are only designed so we get this as solid a draft as possible. Sometimes Mary Quaid makes the point that you find a staff member who does work well with a person and you seek guidance. There are quirks to all of us, and there are some things, you may have used a word that that person thinks is indicative of being for or against something. I used to work in the pro-choice, pro-life, abortion issues, and I know that sometimes you could use a word without even thinking about it, and that person would be mentally putting you into one camp or another. So you constantly try to bend over backwards and work on it. We're low on time, so I'm going to move on to the next question, which is who decides? You're a legislator and you give the drafter a set of drafting instructions for a revision of the criminal code. After you've given the instruction, the drafter explains there may be a constitutional problem with one of your provisions. You've listened to all the drafter's points and you tell them, well, I still want the provision. The next draft comes back with a little memo saying the key provision is missing, and the drafter did further research, decided to drop the provision. What do you do? So you're the legislator now, and what's your response to the drafter who dropped this provision? Well, getting one response about calling the director, getting a number of talking to the boss. I think there's, and Susan Fox saying insist to be put in the bill, drafter's note can be put in the file. I think it goes back to a number of aspects of read and insist that Jeff Wentworth talked about, explaining, this is the point where this is the draft, the legislator's choice. The legislator, from the legislator's standpoint, was as clear as possible. So it's either a point of being insistent with the legislator and insisting that it go back in, or going straight to the drafter's supervisor, or as Peggy Piety is mentioning, working with both the drafter and the drafter's supervisor. I think there's an aspect here of giving the drafter the benefit of the doubt and trying to improve them, but when they clearly go against something that you had insisted on, then you've done your due diligence, and it's the time possibly to go to the supervisor. I am getting reminders from various drafters saying that it's important to remember not to misrepresent the drafter's advice. I think part of the drafter's reluctance in here is they don't want you going down the wrong step. They don't want you making a mistake and losing your whole bill because one key provision is going to make it unconstitutional or have other problems. The drafters may be acting out of your best interest, but if you're insistent on it and you understand it, that's important. It's also important that you don't tell other legislators that the drafter told you that it was okay. Going to move on to a couple more. What goes in the drafting file? You're the drafter, and the legislator gives you a full description of a problem of a property crime in her district, changes she wants, but then she also says that she really needs the support of the district attorney, and in the next election, and the district attorney should be consulted as the draft is developed. Your state is an open record on introduction state. You mention anything about consulting with the district attorney in the drafting file? You put everything in the drafting file? What would you put in the drafting file? Having one interesting comment that our drafting files are protected for 75 years, then we'll all be gone. So some of you may have no problem at all. I think I'm seeing some ideas about coordinating, mentioning that the legislator wants to coordinate with the district attorney for input. You can know why the DA has been consulted, but in the drafting file, just mentioning that it's important to consult with the DA as you go forward. Listing, Susan Fox mentions the list as a contact, no details. I think it helps those dealing with future work on this to know that the DA was being consulted. There are plenty of legitimate, reasons legally to be contacting the DA. So that can go in without the full reasons for doing so. Let me also give you one shot at the last question here before we have to go off the line. And that's the whole question of, do you cross the political line? Here's a situation where you've never worked with Senator Jones before. He has a reputation for being very conservative, suspects that all you drafters are closet liberals. He gives you a drafting request and you think that there will be political ramifications that he hasn't considered. In fact, taking the position may actually make him look bad with his fellow conservatives. Now, there's a line of thought that drafters shouldn't venture into the political sphere, not give political advice, but there's also the idea that you try to help legislators as best you can. Look out so that they don't get surprised, hit upside by a 2x4 when they're not expecting it. So do you speak up or be quiet? Do you say something, and if you would say something, what would you say? So how do you see that venturing into the political sphere, and what's your duty to the senator who really thinks you're a closet liberal? Well, there's one admission out here that we really are all liberals, so that's one aspect of it. Another piece that drafters should not offer political advice. Number of people speaking up about regarding political clarifications, making the question of raising the issue generally so you can see whether he wants to or not, drafting the request and point out specific provisions, saying it's outside the scope of the drafter. I think the lion's share of the results tend to go that way, but I'm also getting something from Cynthia Keeper about unintended results of legislative drafting are a part of your job. Peggy Piety saying that you very deferentially call the issue to the legislator's attention. I think Susan Fox does this an advantage of mentioning that we don't give political advice, but we do is policy clarifications, pros and cons. I think it's back to one of those tightropes that E.M. Miller mentioned earlier. You don't want to push things, but I think you would raise it, the idea of, I'm raising this from the standpoint of, I want to make sure that you're comfortable with this. I want to make sure that it fits within your political philosophy. I just want to help you think it through. I think it's one of those things that you speak, you do it as deferentially as possible. In some ways, these kinds of things, when you do it well, are the things that build up the most trust in ever, because it really shows the legislator that you are trying to do your level best for him or her. You're trying to make sure that they do good work from their own perspective, not from your perspective. Cynthia Johnson raises a really good point, and she said, I would keep quiet on political issues unless I knew the legislator well. And I think this crossing of the political line or stepping toward it is the sort of thing that you do when you really trust the legislator as well as the legislator trusts you. And I think you're more willing to go up to this and explore the line when both of you trust each other well. And it's just, I gave you the aspect of you've never worked with Senator Jones before. So that may lead you to a more cautious approach. And sort of going to Doug Heim's point. We have 2 minutes left. You've done a wonderful job. You've raised many questions along the way. If there are other questions now, we'll try to get to as many of those as possible and go ahead and send them in the same way. Also, Kay and I'll take questions later on if you want to discuss these on the substance. You can talk to Kay about the logistical aspects of this presentation. The entire broadcast will be put up on the web, so you can go back to portions of it. You'll also be getting an evaluation sent out later today, and this will help us move forward. So you can type in some questions now. We now have about 1 minute left. So if there's anything that's burning that you want to raise, that's fine. Otherwise, you can send these questions to me on the substance, to Kay on the logistics of the presentation, again with the idea that it'll be up on the website, both on the Legal Services Staff Section website and on the Legislative Effectiveness Committee website. I see that we have reached the end of our time, so I will take more questions by email. I thank you all. Wonderful comments along the way. Really appreciate it. And again, would appreciate, much as Doug Heim said, surveying helps you get better at your job. Surveying helps us get better at our job. So if you would fill those out, we truly appreciate it. And thank you all. Have a good day.